Hello, PPN community, and thanks for joining us for our next session where we're going to be talking about fraud, trust, and reputations and why your finance team might be at risk. And I'm delighted to be joined in the conversation by renowned fraud expert, Robert Brooker. Hello, Rob. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your expertise with the PPN network.
Thank you for inviting me, Ellen. As always, an absolute delight to be here.
Well, thanks very much. So we're talking about fraud today, and in particular, its relevance to finance teams. Do you think it's something which is more prevalent now than it has been in the past?
I'm really sad to say fraud is a growing industry. We look at industry at the moment, we look at corporate, UK corporate, and ultimately we could argue we're on the verge of a recession and we were struggling. The one industry that's thriving, sadly, is fraud. And why is it particularly around the finance industry? Because it's money, and that's where money is. And look, I know this goes back and it's always the case, and historically you will see it's always the case. During financial crisis, fraud will always be on the increase. The reason for that is desperate times call for desperate measures. So whether it's to put bread on the table or a roof over the head, or just greedy people realizing there's an opportunity and looking at control witnesses during that time, fraud always goes hand in hand with a financial crisis. So yes, fraud is very much on the rise, and the varying typologies that we're seeing, and I'm sure you've experienced, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that we all need to be on our guard.
I mean, it's sad to hear, a growth industry. And it's certainly, looking at some of the reports and news items that we share on PPN, it almost seems like a weekly occurrence. You've shared some of the reasons why, and do you think that is the main reason? Then it's the financial situation at the moment. It just encourages fraudsters to come out of the woodwork, or is there any other reason why you think fraud levels are so high at the moment, or still so high? Because, you've got some elements of technology involved, haven't we?
That's it. And we're all looking at the technology side, but don't forget the fraudsters are always one step ahead with technology. So we're talking about AI very much so, everybody at the moment. Don't forget the fraudsters are using AI too. And the way they use AI is to obviously counterbalance and counteract what we're trying to do. So I think you're quite right. And the other reason, Ellen, and I've talked about this in the past, and obviously now with the change of government just recently, it will be interesting to see how this opens up and what happens in the future, is currently 40% of all crime in the UK is fraud related. Just think about that, 40%. That's an awful lot. That shows you the rise of fraud. And the flip side to that is there is only 1% of policing dedicated to investigating fraud. Now, if you was to take, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to anyone, any other crime type, whether it be rape, murder, drugs, and it was 40%, I'm pretty sure that the percentage of policing dedicated to investigating it would be a lot larger than 1% that are investigating fraud. So I think coupled with the economic crisis, coupled with the fact that we do have a real gap in terms of policing and fraud and how we can manage that. I think that's why we're sitting here now. As people were sitting at home, how can I earn money without leaving the front room? A laptop, an iPad, a mobile phone, and you can commit online fraud. And let's be honest about it, that's where it is. And we all know that's what it is. You don't need to go out and get your hands dirty and be an armed robber anymore. You just sit in your own front room.
I suppose, yes. I mean, hearing you say that, I guess it's something which is becoming easy, isn't it? Like you say, you don't have to go outside. Maybe you don't feel those threats, and certainly, perhaps, if there's only 1% of the police force looking at it, perhaps there is no real threat that's perceived by them. And one of the things that we say to people as far as technology is concerned, make something easy, and actually, people take part in it, they actually use it. And that's the same, I guess, for fraudsters, isn't it?
It is. There's something called the Cressy Triangle, the fraud triangle, and it's around opportunity. So if we provide the fraudster with the opportunity to commit fraud, i.e. weak control frameworks, then obviously they're going to take that advantage. And the other two sides of that triangle are around rationalization. People will always find a reason why they're doing it. There's
Mm.
always a reason as an insider, for instance, I didn't get a pay increase, I didn't get promoted, I didn't get a bonus, I didn't get this, that, or the other. And then the other is the motivation and the morale and the motivation around committing fraud. And let's be honest about it, we all want money, whether it's to keep our heads under a roof and put bread on the
Mm.
table, or whether it's to live the high life. Everybody wants money, so that's easy as to why you would do it. But ultimately, fraud will always be there. We need to be on our guard, more than on our guard, proactively looking at fraud. So continuous monitoring of financial transactions, using AI if we can. But
Mm.
ultimately, we need to be on the front foot rather than reactive and waiting for something to go wrong. And that's where I think all of us need to work together, the sharing of information around who is trying to defraud us and what to look out for next, which is something that you as P2P Network do brilliantly in your weekly newsletters every Friday. There's always a fraud article in there, Ellen, and I
There
love
is.
reading about whatever it may be. I'll tell you why, because we can all learn from it. And let's
Mm.
just remember that, share it, work together. Collaboration is the only way that we're going to prevent fraud.
Yeah, I mean, I think like anything, it's sharing that information, as you say, is about letting people know that it's happening, because sometimes many people think, well, do you know what, it can't happen in my organization. But part of the reasons why we share that news on PPN is for that very reason, as you say. Actually, it does happen, and it happens in organizations like yours, obviously not yours, but people listening, organizations like yours, and it happens quite a lot. And this is how it happens. And once you share that information, people think, actually, do you know what? Maybe we do need to knuckle down on some of those controls.
And it
But
is
what
the
about, sorry.
learning outcome. It is the learning outcome, Ellen. We can all learn at somebody else's expense, sadly, that has become the victim of fraud. But actually, don't let us become the next victim. Let's
Mm.
ensure that whatever it is that's occurred in that instance, let's make sure that we've got that tightened. The control mechanisms are tight, the mitigations are tight, and we can't let that go out the door, and we can't be affording to lose that money. And I think you're quite right. We all learn from each other, but it's in ensuring we work together to help prevent, detect, and deter that fraud.
Yes, absolutely. Um, and what about the part to play here in legislation? Are there any existing legislative policies, or any legislation upcoming that you know about that might help us here?
Of course. So currently, we all adhere to the Fraud Act of 2006 and the Bribery Act of 2010. But it's really quite apt at the moment in that we had at the back end of 2023 the Act of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which, as many of you know, within finance involved the Companies House reform as it's become now, and that legislation and how that will change, which will equally help us all, because it means that people have to prove their identity when setting up a company, and hopefully that will deter the fraudsters to some extent. The most important part of the legislation here with regards to fraud is the failure to prevent fraud
Mm.
legislation. Now, this only applies to larger businesses, so you have to fit 2 or 3 criteria. And so those 3 criteria are: you employ 250 people, you turn over 36 million pounds, or you have 18 million pounds on the balance sheet. Now, I'm sure the majority of people in their firms here today probably fit 2 of those 3 criteria. So therefore, the failure to prevent will apply to you. What would the failure to prevent fraud mean? It basically means that if you are to commit fraud, if you are to become the victims of fraud and you are implicit in that fraud as a company and an organization, you have to undertake reasonable procedures. And that is the only defense, will be the reasonable procedures to prevent it and deter it and ensure that you're not the next victim. So what do we mean by reasonable procedures? Now, these are due to be announced during the next few months with the new change of government, and hopefully we'll have this very soon. But reading between the lines and hearing what's going on, and I did contribute towards a paper prior to the reasonable procedures being announced, we're following the lines of the failure to prevent bribery in the 2010 Bribery Act. So it should
Mm.
be very similar. In, first of all, fraud risk assessments. Has your organisation undertaken fraud risk assessments? If you have, but please note the emphasis here is on fraud in all of this legislation. So have you undertaken fraud risk assessments? If you have, and they're up to date, and you move with them as something changes within the organisation, that would be great. That would be a reasonable procedure you have in place. Because listen, we all expect that you can still become the victim of fraud, even if we have these reasonable procedures in place. The second is around policies and procedures. Do you have a fraud policy? Do you have a response plan? Do your other policies and procedures, like for instance, disciplinary code of conduct, do they all refer to fraud and what can happen? So policies and procedures all the time mentions fraud and is relevant to the fraud landscape within your organization. The third element will be education, awareness and training. Not just once when you join, probably not just once annually as part of your compliance check. Is do you then put out regular? So you could say that you sign up to the purchase to pay networks, and they obviously advertise the fact that we mentioned fraud and the risks and what's going on in the world with fraud, but you need to then share that with the rest of your organization.
Mm.
Could you have a regular heartbeat, month on month, week on week, of where you're mentioning fraud stories, where you're educating people of what fraud looks out like, what to look out for, what's specific within your industry, and then the training and the education, ensure you're training your staff on a regular basis, and when a new fraud becomes apparent, make sure you're telling them about it. And the other important piece of all of this is to ensure you have tone at the top. Now, the
Mm.
tone at the top doesn't mean the chief exec or the MD. It means the
Mm.
whole of that senior leadership team. That then cascades down to the next level of management, and then that's cascaded to all of the staff and employees. So please make sure, what do we mean by tone from the top? It's around culture and behaviors and consequences for those behaviors. So let's make sure that if somebody commits fraud, we don't just usher them out the back door or we sweep it under the carpet and hope it goes away. We publicise the fact that we have been victims of fraud. We don't have to name people, but let's advertise the fact that we have been, because you're going to learn from that. You're going to ensure thematically you look across the rest of your organisation and ensure that actually we are confident. Sitting here today, we can provide assurance that we don't have fraud in our organisation. That's the way you do it. If you ignore it and there are others
Mm.
in your organisation committing fraud at that time, I'm afraid to say they'll carry on, because that's the
Mm.
tone from the top. That's the behaviour and the culture of that organisation. So yeah, really good piece of legislation coming in from our perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound very comprehensive. And so that if you are doing all of those things, then it seems like you're going a long, long way to making sure that fraud is not happening in your own organization. And I think that tone from the top piece is so, so important, isn't it? The the ability to share that information. And I guess, and I don't know if anyone's listening, I'm sure they are, who were at our annual event in June at the Hurlingham Club. One of the things that we talked about there from our second keynote, Sarah Furness, she was talking about admitting mistakes and actually the benefit that can be done from that, rather than hiding things under the carpet only for them to sort of resurface much worse at a later stage. So and if any of you are not connected with Sarah Furness, I do, it would be great if you would look at her LinkedIn profile, because she shares some really interesting information around this topic. So that sounds pretty comprehensive, Robert. At PPN, as you know, and we've just talked about, we share a lot of stories about fraudulent activities that have happened. And just recently, there's been an influx or an increase of those types of fraud where the perpetrator's been at the company for quite a long period of time. Do you think that sometimes that fraudulent attempt happens because there's an excess of trust?
Of course, and people say, oh, people in finance wouldn't commit fraud. You're taken as a stand-up kind of pillar of your community in which you work, both externally and internally.
Mm.
People think that you're that kind of thing. You're a finance director, you're a finance controller, you work in credit management. You wouldn't be that kind of person. Why would you do that? You've got a really good job, you're well educated. Why would you do it? And listen, I'm not being judgmental as to why people commit fraud, because there are many reasons. You fall on hard times and then you haven't got the money to live the life you're used to, or pay the mortgage or pay the rent. That's understandable. That can happen. But there's two sides to that, as we said earlier. There's the greed and the need. And what we see time and time again, and this all links back into why people end up down this route, is the greed is those that want to live that extravagant lifestyle, the holidays, the
Mhm.
cars, the watches, the clothing, designer clothing, etc., versus the need, which is the roof over the head and the bread on the table. And what happens, and none of us know really when we read these stories, as you say, Helen, that you very kindly share, and it is good if you read them. I'll tell you why, because you'll learn from them. Read between the lines of what they've done. You can read directly in the articles Ellen sends out, and make sure that your organisation is tight in those areas and the control framework has been tightened, and you review what you're doing at that time. But that was the profile of a fraudster. And I sit here as a 50-odd-year-old man, been in a company X amount of years, worked your way up through the company, so therefore everyone respects you and trusts you. You know how everything works within the organization, the processes and the people and the procedures. And unfortunately, you then commit fraud. We've seen a slight change in that, but you're quite right, Ellen. That is what we're seeing in those cases within finance. I think more generally and generically, what we're seeing a change with is it's a little bit like if you're burgled at home. Don't go look and see whether the TV's there or whether the skybox or your laptop's there. More importantly, are your utility bills there? Is your passport there? And is your driving license there? The reason why? That's data. That's around data. That's around you as an individual and how the fraudsters can go and use that information. And it's the same in an organization now. What we're finding is people are targeting organizations, particularly contact centers or call centers, get as much data from a customer database as they can, whether it be name, address, telephone number, email address, bank account details, job title, company they work for. You've then got a profile of somebody that you can then sell on. And this is what happens. They sell it on the dark net. And then ultimately, when you and I hear of our nan, granddad, aunt, uncle, mum or dad being the victim to fraud, and continually what's happening is they're receiving text messages, WhatsApp messages, phone calls, email. That's because unfortunately those lists are known as sucker lists, and they put them on here. They've got all the information and data, and then they phone them and phone them and phone them, email and text, and eventually people crumble and they just do what they want to do. And that's what that part of it is around the theft of data, and data is worth so much more money. In terms of those working for a long time in an organization, as I just described, that's complacency. That becomes complacent as you as the employee, but also more importantly those around you. So the learning outcome from this for all of us, don't become complacent with those people. Change those people's roles and jobs. Ensure they're reporting into different people or different people report into them. Ensure that they're changing their passwords. Ensure they're training their control system. And don't, just because you work in finance, give them that autonomy that allows them to go and commit that fraud because they've been there a long time. Just please make sure that there is an approval process in place. And I always go back to SAP or Oracle in this case, and the amount of times I've undertaken investigations whereby the lead signatory will pass over because they're away as their substitute would be their PA or would be somebody underneath them. It shouldn't be somebody underneath. It should be somebody the same level as you that's going to scrutinize that invoice before it gets sent out to make sure it is how much it should be. It's being sent to the right bank account and being sent to the right people. If we don't do that, that unfortunately also leads to other fraud. And I've seen that whereby they're paying themselves, for instance. So don't give autonomy to anybody. Don't get complacent with people and feel too comfortable because they've been in the business a long time, worked their way through the company and now in a very high up position. Please, as Ellen says, just all of us need to be on our guard and respect everybody, but equally don't take anything for granted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's about having those levels of controls in place and to try and protect ourselves and protect the organization against having too much trust in an individual, because as you say, and as you were just saying, that it can quite so often be that person that's been in the company for a very, very long time that has that excess of trust put upon them. But it's not just financial damage, is it, when we're talking about fraud? Do you think that when we're talking about finance teams, do you think that there is an emotional damage to pay
Very
as
much.
well?
Very much so, and this is where fraud really takes hold, Helen, is that we hopefully with indemnity insurance, things like that, we can cover the money. The money is a bit of a blow, but it's not the end of the world. We can impact some businesses we do see going to the wall because they've been a victim of fraud, and that is so, so sad. But in most cases, there will be an insurance in place. There will be enough pipeline to be able to continue to work and continue to do what you're doing. Sadly, that may impact on staffing, and some people may have to be redundant. And that's then where it starts. How do we recover from a fraud? And it's you working with that individual, first of all. The morale of that team the minute a fraud is announced. You can't get away from that. That morale dips straight away. You're all looking at each other, wondering who it is, who's involved. Do we know the people involved, even if it's on the outside? How have they done it? And all of a sudden, the focus isn't on your day job. The focus is this, which is understandable. What is the fraud? How's it happened? Who's involved? Do we know them? How much money is it? Oh, he lives that life, this life, and all rumour and speculation starts. All of a sudden, back to Ellen's point, and very much apt at the moment, and very much front and centre, and so it should be, is the mental health of those individuals in that team. First of all, as a company and an organisation, even for the person that is the perpetrator, we need to be respectful and understand what they're going through, because it's probably a change, probably very different. They're not that kind of person, really. They've either done it because they've got away with it and they're living the life because they've got that extra money, or they have fallen on hard times. But also the rest of that team, everyone's looking at that team as being the fraudster. And the mental health impact that has on you, the morale, the overall cost also. This isn't just the thing about fraud isn't just the money lost out the door. It's the cost of replacing that individual, the cost of the investigation, the cost of the recruitment process, getting a temporary member of staff in, advertising for the role moving forward. There are lots of implications financially, but also, and I can't emphasize it enough, is what impact that has on that team long term. People want to leave. People won't stay. They don't want to be involved with something where a fraud's occurred. People have looked at them. They've had to be interviewed during that process, A, as potentially the suspect, B, as a witness, to probably speak against somebody that you might have a drink with on a Friday night, you've even been on holiday with, you socialise, play football with, or whatever it may be. You go out and have a meal with families, the kids play together, whatever. All of a sudden, there's a bigger picture to just this one fraud that's occurred in your organisation. And I think it's really important to respect everybody in that situation and understand what they're going through, not just the person who's committed it, but the rest of that team, and also the senior management of that individual and that team, because that's an extremely stressful time. We can't get on with their day job. Everything is looked towards investigating it. If police are involved, you've got that kind of pressure from the policing, wanting information, wanting data. All of a sudden, we're moving out to the IT people who are having to get us data. We're moving out to the customer services teams, who's been involved in that transaction. There are so many more people that get involved in this, and then all of a sudden, the whole business is being completely brought down by this one fraud that's occurred, and the impact that has on everybody in terms of output for the organization, in terms of morale of the staff, in terms of the outside. If you think about it, it takes years. And then I was discussing beforehand, it takes years to build a reputation and for that reputation to be respected. With one little fraud, that can just disappear overnight. Contracts disappear. People don't want to work with you. They'll go elsewhere. And all of a sudden, really is hard times. So yes, Ellen, back to your point, it's more than just the money that's lost due to the fraud.
Yeah, and it's ongoing, isn't it? As you say, you know, it can continue and continue, and I think for people within that team, it can feel unfair as well, because they're not just obviously unfair that that person has done that to the company, but unfair on them personally. You've been part of a team working really, really hard to help your organization's growth and the reputation of your organization, and suddenly somebody who you trusted has done something to bring that all crashing down. And it's interesting you say about going on holiday, because as you know, sharing some of the stories as we do at PPN, that's quite often the time that these frauds get discovered, because someone's gone on holiday, or perhaps maybe someone's retired or something like that, and then suddenly they get looked into. But as you were saying, the person who does that sometimes is a team member, is obviously a team member who could have known that person for a very long time, and then they have to think to themselves, what do I do here? And it's a very difficult place to put someone. So I think, for those listening today, it's that you tend to think of fraud as just money, but it's all sorts of other things, as I guess the title to our session today suggests. Trust and reputations goes a long way into it as well, and even talking about CEO frauds.
Yes.
We're seeing a lot more of those at the moment at PPN. Do you think that's something which is on the increase as well?
It's really interesting, and CEO fraud, and you're right, it is on the increase. We see it regularly, but I think that's because we've got a little bit complacent with it. I go back, I'm old enough now to have worked in fraud and go back to when they used to send a letter purporting to be from the CEO internally, or a memo, should I say, rather than a letter. Those of us
I
old
remember
enough,
those.
I was going to say, those of us old enough on here would remember them. And they were physical pieces of paper from a
Mm,
CEO asking you to pay this, that, or the other, or could you do this, that, or the other, or the chief finance officer. And then we've seen that progress, obviously, over time to it becomes an email. Now, what we're seeing, as you rightly say, Ellen, is account takeover of the CEO or the chief finance officer or other senior members of staff, whereby you receive an email that you purport to be from your CEO, or chief finance. It doesn't have to be the CEO. Let's just make that clear. We're
mm,
just calling it CEO fraud because ultimately, predominantly, that is what we're seeing. So the email comes through from your CEO and says, "Oh, I've been chased by XYZ company. Could you pay invoice 123 immediately, please, so I can get them off my back?" And the problem is, as an individual sitting in that finance team, you think, "Crikey, the CEO wants it done. I've got to do it now." And
mm,
we don't take the time and the care to look into the fact that, hold on a moment, what is that invoice? What is it in respect of? Have they really had to go back? It's quite often an account diversion, bank mandate fraud that they're doing, and they're asking the CEO to pay immediately. And the other thing is just pick up the phone. Just ask the CEO, have you actually sent me this? Is this email really from you? I've received an email. We all know the way the CEO talks and how he behaves.
mhm,
If he's somebody who's very forthright and the email's forthright, you might think, oh, okay, he'd be like that. But would he normally email you to ask you to make a payment? Probably not. But in the whole scheme of it, we become completely blindfolded to the fact that the CEO's on it and we panic a little bit. And that
mm,
doesn't matter how many years you've been in an organization, how experienced we all are. It's one of those times you think, oh, I've got to just pay this. So just take your time, ask him, have you sent this? You might have internal messenger or whatever. Just send him a message on there or pick up the phone and just ask it. And he'll say, no, of course I haven't. I haven't done that. Particularly if it is coming from the FD, CFO. It's the same thing. You know how they speak and how they talk. And quite often, they're very mild mannered people, but the email might say, pay this now. And
mhm,
it's quite curt. There might be spelling mistakes in it, and you know that individual isn't that kind of person. They're very particular and very precise at how they write an email. They always sign it off all the best, or they always sign it off kind regards, or thank you very much, whatever it might be.
mhm.
Just always look at it and think about it. But the easiest way, rather than trying to second guess it, is message, pick up the phone, and just ask the question, have you actually sent me this email?
Yeah. I mean, there are quite often, as you say, telltale signs, aren't there? And I'm sure there are people listening to us today who are thinking, "Gosh, how ridiculous! I would never fall for anything like that." But the very fact that it's a growth industry suggests that there are a lot of people who do fall for that, for their CEOs who can be female as well as male.
Of course they are, of course. And
um,
ultimately, what that is, Ellen, you're quite right, is that I wouldn't fall for that, isn't the thing. Why do these
no,
people keep sending them? If you throw enough mud, some will stick. So
absolutely.
ultimately, they only need one to come through, and the next payment that goes out is six figures. And ultimately, that's where we sit today. Is unfortunately that six figures has gone out the door, and the impact that has through no fault of anybody, apart from let's be on our guard, taking a bit of caution around fraud, and making sure that we are doing all we can before we make those payments.
And then they can themselves be personally liable, depending on the type of fraud and the company that they're in, of course. So we've talked a little bit about reputational damage. I mean, what do you think the effects of that can be on a company? If it, say, for example, it's been reported in the is it? It's not just external; it can be internal as well, can't it?
Of course, very much so. So you look, and we talked about this very earlier
Mm,
at the very beginning. Is sadly, I have seen companies have to go into administration because they've been a victim of fraud, and they just don't have cash at bank to carry on, to pay wages, to pay suppliers, and rather than suppliers trying to wind them up, they just do it themselves and go to the wall. And that is the worst case scenario, obviously, Ellen, whereby people just cannot continue, the company can't continue, and ultimately they just fold it up. And then there's the impact of redundancy and all of the staff, the contractors, and everything else. But the reputational piece, and if you start to lose contracts, so as we said, it takes years to build up a reputation around the services or goods that you're offering. That can disappear overnight. If people then stop using you and they're not buying from you anymore, or you're not providing that service to them, they go elsewhere to get it because they've lost confidence in the product or in the company. All of a sudden, your cash flow goes down, and you could end up in the same position in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months' time. Or you make cuts during that time to try and offset that, and you make the cuts in terms of what you do, how you go about it. You lay off staff, you rely on more people doing less people doing more, as we're also used to in the finance world, through just natural kind of transformation. But ultimately, when a fraud occurs, that's what people could do and how they go about it. And it just makes life really difficult, particularly for you guys as finance teams. Your workload won't change. Accounts payable, accounts receivable, you'll still all have the same amount of work. But unfortunately, instead of having 10 of you to do it, you might be cut down to 5. But it's that impact both internally and what morale that has on you as staff. And actually, I don't want to be here anymore either. I might hang on and get a redundancy, but ultimately, we're working under so much pressure now. Everyone thinks we worked here. We were involved with a fraud. Mud sticks. Everyone's still looking at us to be involved with it. And actually, I'll get myself out of here. I don't want to be involved with it. The supply chain are the same. The suppliers are the same. They're thinking, well, hold on, we don't really want to be involved with these now. And therefore, those that also are producing or making the stuff working with you also think, well, do you know what? I don't know. Will we get paid this month, next month? They had that fraud. That's had a big impact on them. They look at something like Dun and Bradstreet or Company Watch, and you see their obviously the income falling, and you see the shareholders falling. Let's look at CrowdStrike back earlier in the year with regards to the incident with Microsoft and the outage. Everybody was talking about Microsoft. It was actually a supplier of theirs, CrowdStrike. What impact did that have on CrowdStrike shares? They dropped 30% before trading on that day. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at with fraud, and what impact it has on you as an organization, more importantly, you as an individual. Do I want to work in this company? Am I worried about being paid? Do I like the fact people are still throwing around, oh, yeah, you worked with so-and-so and was involved in the fraud? There's all that kind of conjuncture, if you like, that's all thrown at you, and it doesn't leave a very good taste in the mouth, and it's a very difficult situation for everybody to be involved with. So yeah, reputational damage both internally and externally after a fraud, if you manage to survive it, takes a long time to grow. It's how you publicize what you've done about it. Back to what we were saying earlier, Ellen, it's how you take that tone from the top. You accept that it's happened. You tell people it's happened, whether that be shareholders, whether that be suppliers, whether that be staff. You're open and transparent about it. We've dealt with it. The person's now gone. We've dealt with them. They're being prosecuted elsewhere. This is what we're doing to move on. We've tightened these controls. The auditors are looking at this and that to ensure that we've done that thematically across the rest of the organisation. I just ask you all to be on your guard, and that's those conversations you have and how you deal with it, rather than just sitting there like somebody just going to hide away from it and hope it'll all disappear. That's where the tone from the top really shows itself.
Yeah, and I suppose you want to try and get away from the rumor mill. It helps prevent that, doesn't it? If you're a lot more open with your suppliers, okay, this happened, this is what we're doing, as you said, and maybe that is encourages that more open environment, and then helps to create a better healing process, I guess, for that organization. We've talked about fraud being a growth industry. I was interested to know whether you think that any sectors are more susceptible than others. Do you think that's the case?
If I'm really honest, and there are lots of stats around this and people looking at it, I think it's the same as insolvencies and stuff. If I'm really honest at the moment, no one's immune to fraud. We're all liable, we're all vulnerable. We need to ensure that we have all of those good things that we've talked about as controls and education, awareness, training, fraud risk assessments, moving with as our company moves, we need to ensure they all move with us. Don't just write a policy and leave it on a drawer. I appreciate that doesn't happen anymore. Showing my age again, Ellen. But ultimately, don't
You
just
can
write
a policy and put it in someone's email. It's the same thing.
That's it, exactly that. And we leave it then, and we don't review it annually. We don't ensure that we are moving with. So you have a bit of M&A and buy out another company, or you start to provide another service line. Have we reflected that in our policy and how that risk now sits with us, and have we actually managed that risk? And it's ensuring that we've done all of that, because ultimately, and I don't think anyone on here probably can say your industry has not been a victim of fraud. Might not be yourselves and your company, but ultimately another company within your industry, I'm pretty certain will have suffered from a fraud. Yes, we can all say some are more than others, and the one that we always talk about is the construction industry, and we all think of the terrible things like Carillion and things of that nature that ultimately led back to a fraud. But then you flip it and you look at coffee and cake and you look at patisserie Valerie.
That's right,
So
yeah.
ultimately, there's the two ends of that spectrum, Ellen, to prove my point, if you like, or to re-emphasize the point. I don't think anybody's immune to fraud. I think provided we've got people, we're providing a service or a good, and we have cash transactions and we have regular transactions going out the door, the chances are we're vulnerable to be a victim of fraud unless we ensure that that mechanism is tight as it can be and we're proactive about it. We're not reactive about it, waiting for something to happen.
And I guess and being aware is part of that, isn't it? Aware that we can all be vulnerable, and make sure that our processes, technology, and the people within it are as tight as they can be. Well, I mean, thanks very much for sharing all of your insights with us, Rob. And I know we've talked a lot about sort of fraud and all the terrible things that can happen, which obviously do affect people deeply. I just wondered whether we can leave the people listening to us today on a brighter note. Have you got any I don't know, stats that you can share with us, or any other thoughts?
No, of course. And I think the important part of all of this, and go back to the title of fraud, trust and reputation. If you work that backwards, you trust your staff, the reputation of your business, you won't become the victim of fraud. Ultimately, have that tone from the top, ensure that we trust each other, we build our reputation, we don't put that reputation at risk by becoming the victims of fraud. And actually, there's lots of positives to come out of it. The learning outcomes are fantastic from everybody else. It's sadly they've become the victims, but it means that we won't be. I've got to be honest, it's like anything, isn't it? Fraud is still there. Yes, it is very much so large, but if we've got our house in order and we're protecting our business, we protect our individuals, then the chances of us becoming victims are minimized. So all I ask is we don't just say all of this and we go through all of this for the sake of it, and actually you go away and don't implement some of that stuff or make sure it's up to date and tight. If you do, you are protecting yourself as an individual, protecting your business. And back to that point that's around the trust of you as staff and the reputation. And don't forget, it's not just the reputation of your business, it's your reputation as an individual when you try and get a job after a fraud or something like that. So the positives of it are they're few and far between. There is obviously, providing you've got things in place to prevent fraud, controls, etc. If you haven't and you want to speak about it, go help about it. As we discussed earlier, learn from each other, learn from what procure to pay networks send out. Look at what people are doing. Ask the question. I'm always on LinkedIn. Feel free to ask. Feel free to ask Ellen. We've worked closely. We know what's going on in the industry. Hence the reason we share it. Lots of positives come out of it. I really hope it didn't sound like a real negative
No.
bad day at the office. But all we're doing is, I think we can learn from
Highlighting.
misfortune and make sure we don't put ourselves in that position. And as I say, it's a little bit like Shaw Taylor and what have you, and going back to Ellen and I giving away our age, is keep them peeled. But ultimately, if you do, it'll be okay. And I think you'll be fine, providing you're proactive about it. There are lots of positives to come out of it, not the negative side.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. That seems like a good place to finish our conversation. So I hope everybody has got lots of interesting insights and information to take away with you back to your own organization. And just do check your policies, have a look at your technology, and talk to each other, communicate. And like Rob was saying just now, take a look at, if you haven't already, some of the stories that we share across PPN, and see whether any of those areas might be yours you can look at as well and need to tighten up. And as Rob was saying, I'm sure he and indeed I will be very happy to answer any questions or queries that you might have, particularly in regards to the legislation as well that Rob was talking about just now. But for now, thank you very much, and speak to you soon. Thank you, Rob. Bye-bye.
Bye, Ellen. Thank you.